The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, breaking the pre-dawn silence that had settled over the Afghan mountains like a burial shroud. Staff Sergeant Miguel Restrepo pressed his earpiece deeper, straining to catch the transmission bleeding through the interference. What he heard made his blood run cold. All stations, this is Overwatch. We have a broken arrow situation. Repeat, broken arrow. Grid reference follows. The coordinates that followed pinpointed a location 12 clicks northeast of their position, deep in Taliban-controlled territory where no friendly forces were supposed to be operating. Restrepo's SEAL team had been lying motionless in the rocky outcropping for 6 hours, waiting for their primary target, a high-value individual who had been moving weapons through these mountain passes for months. But a broken arrow changed everything. Somewhere out there, American nuclear assets were compromised, lost, or worse. Lieutenant Commander Jessica "Viper" Nakamura shifted position beside him, her sniper rifle tracking the valley below through her scope. She'd been with the team for 8 months, longer than most pilots ever stayed embedded with ground units. But Viper wasn't most pilots. She was A-10 Thunderbolt II, callsign Hog 77, and she'd requested to be here, boots on the ground, to better understand the mission she supported from 30,000 feet. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to Restrepo, who was inches away. "Thermal imaging shows convoy movement, bearing 270, approximately 4 clicks out. 8 vehicles, mixed civilian and military pattern." The convoy wasn't on their mission brief. Nothing was supposed to be moving through this sector except their target. Restrepo raised his field glasses, scanning the serpentine road that wound through the valley like a scar. In the green glow of his night vision, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes: 3 Toyota Hilux pickups, 2 larger transport trucks, and what looked like captured American Humvees bringing up the rear. "Overwatch, this is Shadow 7, Restrepo transmitted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. "We have eyes on unknown convoy, 8 vehicles, moving toward suspected broken arrow location. Request guidance." The response came immediately. "Shadow 7, you are weapons free. That convoy is carrying American personnel. We need them back." Nakamura's finger moved instinctively toward her radio, muscle memory from hundreds of close air support missions. But her A-10 was back at Bagram, and she was here with nothing but an M4 and the knowledge that American lives hung in the balance. The irony wasn't lost on her. The pilot known for bringing the thunder was about to go silent. Dawn was still 2 hours away when the first shots rang out across the valley, shattering the mountain silence forever. What happened next would redefine everything the military thought it knew about courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between heaven and hell that exists 30,000 feet above the battlefield. The mission that began as routine reconnaissance was about to become legend. The convoy had been moving for 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed by God himself to swallow men whole. Captain Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the small window of the transport truck, watching the endless procession of jagged peaks slide past in the pale moonlight. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, the plastic cutting into her wrists with every bump in the road, but she'd stopped feeling the pain hours ago. 3 days earlier, she'd been Captain Vasquez, United States Air Force, stationed at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Now she was cargo, one of 7 American service members being transported to God only knew where by a group of Taliban fighters who seemed to understand the value of what they'd captured. The ambush had been textbook perfect. Her C-130 transport had been making what should have been a routine supply run to a forward operating base near the Pakistani border when the first missile streaked up from the mountains below. The pilot, Major Sarah Chen, had managed to keep them airborne for almost 30 seconds after impact, 30 seconds that had felt like 30 lifetimes as the aircraft shuddered and bucked like a wounded animal. Vasquez closed her eyes, trying to push away the memory of Chen's voice over the intercom. "Brace for impact. Brace for impact." professional to the end, even as the ground rushed up to meet them. 7 crew members had walked away from the crash. 7 Americans now bouncing through the Hindu Kush in the back of trucks that reeked of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. The Taliban fighters guarding them spoke in hushed Pashto, occasionally glancing at their prisoners with something that might have been respect. They knew what they had. "Hey," whispered Technical Sergeant Marcus Williams, the crew chief who'd been sitting beside Vasquez when the missile hit. "You still got that GPS watch?" Vasquez shook her head slightly. The Taliban had been thorough, stripping them of everything except their dog tags and basic clothing, but Williams smiled grimly. "They missed something," he murmured, lifting his leg slightly. Vasquez could just make out the faint outline of an emergency beacon sewn into the seam of his flight suit. Standard issue for aircrew, designed to activate automatically if separated from the aircraft by more than 2 kilometers for longer than 6 hours. If the beacon was working, if it hadn't been damaged in the crash, if the Taliban's signal jammers hadn't blocked it, then somewhere, someone knew exactly where they were. The truck hit another pothole, and Vasquez felt her shoulder slam against the metal sidewall. Around her, the other prisoners, 2 loadmasters, a radio operator, a medic, and a young airman first class who couldn't be older than 19, maintained the 1,000-yard stare that comes with accepting that your life is no longer in your own hands. But acceptance and surrender were different things entirely. Vasquez had been Air Force for 12 years, had flown combat missions over Iraq and Syria, had seen what happened to American personnel who disappeared into the mountain strongholds of Afghanistan. The Taliban might think they had cargo, but what they actually had was 7 very motivated, very well-trained American service members who had no intention of becoming propaganda videos. The convoy began to slow, the engine note changing as they started climbing a steep grade. Through the window, Vasquez could see the road narrowing, becoming little more than a goat path carved into the mountainside. They were heading deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of conventional rescue. But rescue, Vasquez knew, didn't always come from conventional sources. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura had been lying in the same position for so long that she'd lost feeling in her left leg, but she didn't dare move. Through her scope, she watched the convoy navigate the switchback turns 3 kilometers below, the vehicle's headlights cutting pale swaths through the darkness as they climbed toward the high passes. "Shadow 7, this is Overwatch," came the voice in her earpiece. "We're showing multiple fast movers inbound, ETA 15 minutes. You are cleared to begin reconnaissance and report." Restrepo acknowledged the transmission with a double click, then turned to his team. 6 SEALs spread out along the ridgeline like deadly shadows, each man positioned to cover a different avenue of approach. They'd been doing this dance for years, the careful choreography of special operations that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But this mission felt different, personal. Nakamura adjusted her scope's focus, bringing the lead vehicle into sharp relief. Through the green glow of her night vision, she could make out at least 3 figures in the truck bed, their hands clearly restrained behind their backs. American prisoners, her people. For 8 months, she'd been the angel of death circling overhead, raining down 30 depleted uranium rounds from her A-10's GAU-8 cannon, whenever ground forces called for close air support. The Taliban had learned to fear the distinctive sound of her twin turbofans, the low growl that meant death was diving down from the sky at 400 knots. But now she was down here with them, feeling the cold mountain air bite through her combat gear, tasting the metallic fear that came with knowing that air support was minutes away instead of seconds. It was a different kind of warfare entirely, intimate and unforgiving. "Movement," whispered Petty Officer First Class David Park from his position 50 meters to her right. "Multiple dismounts, bearing 180. Nakamura swung her scope toward the coordinates Park had provided. In the valley below, she could see figures moving away from the convoy, taking up defensive positions among the rocks. The Taliban weren't just transporting prisoners, they were prepared for a fight. "Count 20-plus military-age males," she reported quietly into her radio. "Mixed small arms, at least 2 crew-served weapons visible. They're setting up a perimeter." The implications were clear. This wasn't a simple transport operation. The convoy had stopped at a predetermined location, somewhere the Taliban felt confident enough to make a stand, which meant either they were planning to hold the position or they were planning to execute the prisoners and disappear into the mountains before any rescue force could arrive. Nakamura had flown enough combat missions to recognize a kill zone when she saw one. The convoy had stopped at the bottom of a narrow valley, surrounded on 3 sides by steep slopes that would channel any assault force into a predetermined kill zone. Textbook tactical positioning. But textbook tactics worked both ways. "Shadow 7, this is Hog 77, she transmitted, using her pilot call sign for the first time since joining the ground team. "I'm seeing prepared positions, interlocking fields of fire. This isn't a rest stop, it's a fortress." Restrepo's voice came back immediately. "Copy that, 7-7. What's your professional assessment?" Nakamura studied the terrain through her scope, her pilot's eye automatically calculating angles of attack, dead space, and potential escape routes. After a moment, she keyed her radio again. "Sir, if we're going in hard and fast, because once we commit, there's no backing out." The sound that woke Captain Vasquez wasn't the engine stopping or the voices of their captors. It was silence. After 6 hours of constant road noise, the sudden absence of mechanical sound was as jarring as a gunshot. She opened her eyes to find the truck had stopped in what appeared to be a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, surrounded by towering peaks that blocked out most of the sky. Her fellow prisoners were stirring as well, the sudden lack of motion bringing them back to full awareness. Technical Sergeant Williams caught her eye and nodded toward the rear of the truck, where their Taliban guards were speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Something had changed. The truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and rough hands dragged them from the vehicle. Vasquez's legs nearly buckled as circulation returned, but she forced herself to remain upright, to project the kind of military bearing that might buy them a few more precious minutes of life. Around them, the other vehicles in the convoy were disgorging their human cargo and equipment. Vasquez counted at least 30 Taliban fighters, all carrying modern assault rifles and wearing the kind of tactical gear that suggested this wasn't some ragtag militia group. These were professionals. Their leader appeared to be a man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He surveyed the American prisoners with the clinical interest of a collector examining valuable specimens, then spoke a few words in Pashto to one of his subordinates. "You are pilots?" he asked in accented but clear English, his gaze settling on Vasquez and the other aircrew members. Standard military training dictated that prisoners should provide only name, rank, and serial number. But Vasquez had seen enough intelligence briefings to know that silence sometimes bought more time than compliance. "Captain Elena Vasquez, United States Air Force, service number." The Taliban leader held up a hand, cutting her off. "I know who you are, Captain. Your aircraft was carrying more than supplies when it departed Al-Udeid 3 days ago." His smile was cold. "We know about the package." Vasquez felt her blood turn to ice. The package. The classified cargo manifest that only she and Major Chen had been briefed on. The reason their C-130 had been flying with a minimal crew and a flight path that avoided all major air bases. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. The Taliban leader studied her for a moment, then turned to his men and issued a series of rapid commands in Pashto. Immediately, The fighters began moving into defensive positions among the rocks, setting up machine gun nests and positioning rocket-propelled grenade launchers to cover the approaches to their position. They were preparing for an assault. "Your government will come for you," the leader said, turning back to Vasquez. "They will send their special forces, their helicopters, their close air support aircraft, and when they do, we will be ready." He gestured toward the steep-sided valley that surrounded them. "This place has been preparing for such a day for many years. Your people will come down that road, or they will repel from helicopters, or they will attempt to assault from the ridgelines. All approaches lead to the same place." Vasquez followed his gaze, her pilot's eye automatically analyzing the terrain. He was right. The valley was a perfect kill zone, with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes for the defenders. Any conventional rescue attempt would result in massive casualties. But the Taliban leader had made one critical mistake in his tactical assessment. He was thinking conventionally. At 30,000 feet above the Afghan mountains, Major Rebecca Ghost Morrison adjusted her oxygen mask and ran through her pre-combat checklist one more time. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number 780687, responded to her inputs like a living thing, the twin turbofan engines providing a steady thrum of power that she could feel through the aircraft's titanium bathtub cockpit. "Ghost 2-1, this is Overwatch," came the voice of the airborne controller managing the rescue operation. "We show you 15 minutes out from target area. Be advised, Shadow 7 is on station and has eyes on objective." Morrison keyed her radio. "Copy, Overwatch. Ghost 2-1 is loaded and ready to deliver the mail." The mail, in this case, was 1,100 rounds of 30-depleted uranium ammunition, 8 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and enough high-explosive ordnance to level a city block. But Morrison knew that firepower alone wouldn't win this fight. The prisoners were too close to the enemy positions, the terrain too complex for a simple bombing run. This would require precision, artistry, the kind of surgical violence that separated good close air support pilots from legends. Morrison had been flying A-10s for 7 years, had logged over 1,500 combat hours in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. She'd earned her call sign Ghost, not for her ability to appear and disappear. Any pilot could do that. But for her uncanny ability to put ordnance exactly where it needed to go without touching anything she didn't want to destroy. Today, she would need every bit of that skill. "Ghost 2-1, Shadow 7, came a new voice on the radio, this one ground-based intense with controlled urgency. "We have visual on 7 American prisoners, approximately 30 enemy combatants in prepared positions. Request close air support when ready." Morrison checked her altimeter and airspeed, then began her descent toward the target area. Through her heads-up display, she could see the infrared signatures of the vehicles and personnel scattered across the valley floor like a tactical constellation. "Shadow 7, Ghost 2-1. I'll be making my initial pass from the north, danger close. Keep your heads down." "Copy that, Ghost. We're not going anywhere." Morrison smiled grimly behind her oxygen mask. She'd worked with ground units enough to recognize the particular brand of gallows humor that meant men were about to put their lives on the line for each other. The SEALs below were outnumbered 5-1, operating in hostile territory with no backup except whatever she could provide from above. But that was enough. It had to be. She rolled into her attack dive, feeling the familiar sensation of controlled falling that preceded every close air support mission. The ground rushed up to meet her, details resolving with crystalline clarity. Muzzle flashes from enemy positions, the distinctive heat signatures of American prisoners huddled near the vehicles, the geometric patterns of defensive positions that had been carefully prepared for exactly this kind of assault. The Taliban had chosen their ground well. They'd anticipated air support, had positioned their anti-aircraft weapons to cover the most likely approach routes, had even dug decoy positions to confuse infrared targeting systems. But they hadn't counted on Rebecca Morrison. She was about to show them why the A-10 Thunderbolt II was still the most feared aircraft in the world, and why the pilots who flew them were considered the guardian angels of American ground forces. The first burst from her GAU-8 cannon lit up the valley like thunder. The sound of Morrison's A-10 was unmistakable, a deep, bone-rattling bellow that seemed to emerge from the earth itself before revealing its true source high above. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura had heard that sound hundreds of times from the cockpit of her own Thunderbolt, but experiencing it from the ground was entirely different. It wasn't just noise. It was presence, the audible manifestation of American air power descending like the wrath of God. Ghost 2-1, Shadow 7, Restrepo transmitted, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting in the valley below. Good hits on the northern position. You've got approximately 6 enemy KIA, but they're repositioning toward the prisoners. Nakamura tracked the movement through her scope, watching Taliban fighters dash between cover positions while maintaining their perimeter around the captured Americans. The enemy commander was good. Instead of panicking under air attack, he was using the prisoners as human shields, knowing that any pilot would hesitate to engage targets too close to friendly personnel. But Morrison wasn't just any pilot. Shadow 7, Ghost 2-1. I'm coming around for another pass. Danger close, 60 meters south of friendly position. You'll want to keep those pretty heads down. Through her scope, Nakamura watched the A-10 circle back, its distinctive twin-engine configuration and straight wings making it look more like a flying tank than a conventional aircraft, which, she reflected, was exactly what it was designed to be. Morrison's second attack run was a masterpiece of precision flying. Instead of the broad strafing pattern typical of most close air support missions, she walked her 30 cannon fire along the enemy positions with surgical accuracy, each burst lasting less than half a second, but placing depleted uranium rounds exactly where they would do the most damage while avoiding the cluster of prisoners. "Jesus," whispered Petty Officer Park, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "She's threading the needle at 400 knots. Nakamura nodded, professional admiration overriding the tactical situation for a moment. Morrison was flying the kind of mission that separated competent pilots from artists, threading her aircraft through mountain peaks and surface-to-air missile threats while delivering precision fire support that would make a sniper jealous. But the Taliban weren't done fighting. "RPG!" shouted Specialist Collins from his position on the eastern slope, and Nakamura swung her scope to see a rocket-propelled grenade streak upward from a concealed position, its vapor trail drawing a line of death toward Morrison's aircraft. The missile missed by less than 50 meters, exploding harmlessly in the thin mountain air, but its message was clear. The Taliban had been saving their anti-aircraft weapons for exactly this moment. Morrison's next pass would be contested. Ghost 2-1, Shadow 7. Be advised, enemy has shoulder-fired SAMs, confirmed RPG-29s. Recommend you maintain altitude and use standoff weapons. Morrison's response was immediate. Negative, Shadow 7. Those Marines don't have time for standoff weapons. I'm going in. Nakamura felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Morrison was about to fly directly into a kill zone, betting her life and her aircraft that she could deliver the kind of precision fire support that would break the Taliban perimeter before their anti-aircraft weapons could bring her down. It was exactly what Nakamura would have done in the same situation. They came around for its third pass, this time approaching from the west at an altitude that put it well within range of every weapon the Taliban possessed. Through her scope, Nakamura could see muzzle flashes erupting all across the valley as small arms fire reached upward like deadly fireworks, the tracer rounds creating geometric patterns against the pre-dawn sky. Morrison flew straight through it all, her aircraft rocking slightly from near misses but holding steady on its attack vector. The GAU-8 cannon spoke again, its distinctive sound echoing off the mountain walls as 30 rounds walked through enemy positions with mechanical precision. This time, something changed. The return fire from the valley floor began to slacken, and through her scope, Nakamura could see figures in Taliban positions either not moving at all or moving in the disorganized fashion that suggested panic rather than tactical repositioning. Shadow 7, Ghost 2-1. I count 15 enemy KIA, remaining forces appear to be falling back to secondary positions. You've got a window. Restrepo was already moving before Morrison finished her transmission. Hand signals sending his SEAL team flowing down the mountainside like water finding its level. Nakamura adjusted her position to provide overwatch, her sniper rifle tracking potential targets while her teammates bounded between cover positions in the carefully choreographed assault pattern that Special Operations Forces had perfected over decades of combat. The rescue phase of the operation was about to begin. Captain Vasquez felt the zip ties around her wrists loosen and fall away, cut by hands she couldn't see in the chaos and gunsmoke that now filled the valley. Around her, she could hear American voices shouting tactical commands, the distinctive sound of M4 carbines engaging targets, and the continued thunder of the A-10 circling overhead like a protective angel. "Ma'am, can you move?" The voice belonged to a Navy SEAL whose face was painted in camouflage patterns that made him nearly invisible in the pre-dawn light. Behind him, she could see other members of his team establishing a defensive perimeter while engaging the remaining Taliban fighters. "Yes," she managed, flexing her fingers to restore circulation. "The others." "We've got them," the SEAL assured her. "But we need to move now. This LZ is going to get hot in about 60 seconds. Vasquez looked around and saw her fellow crew members being helped to their feet by other members of the rescue team. Technical Sergeant Williams was bleeding from a head wound, but appeared mobile. The young airman first class was in shock but responsive. All 7 Americans were alive and capable of movement. That was about to become critically important. "Shadow 7, this is Ghost 2-1, came Morrison's voice over the SEAL's radio. "I'm showing movement from the east and south. Looks like reinforcements, approximately 20 vehicles. ETA your position 12 minutes. The SEAL team leader, who Vasquez now saw wore Lieutenant Commander's insignia, nodded grimly. "Copy, Ghost. We're moving to Extraction Point Alpha." Extraction Point Alpha turned out to be a relatively flat area about 800 meters up the valley, far enough from the Taliban positions to be secure, but close enough to reach on foot. The problem was that 800 meters in mountain terrain, while carrying wounded personnel and under enemy fire, might as well have been 800 miles. The SEALs moved like ghosts through the rocky landscape, each man covering specific sectors, while the team bounded forward in pairs. Vasquez found herself assigned to a petite woman in combat gear who moved with the fluid precision of someone completely comfortable with violence. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Nakamura," the woman said as they took cover behind a boulder while another SEAL team provided covering fire. "Air Force." "Captain Vasquez, your Navy." Nakamura smiled, and there was something in that expression that spoke of shared experience, of the particular camaraderie that existed between military aviators regardless of service branch. "Guilty as charged, though I usually do my fighting from 30,000 feet in an A-10. Vasquez stared at her. "You're a pilot. What are you doing down here?" "Learning," Nakamura replied simply, "and right now getting you home." They moved again, this time covering 200 meters of broken ground, while Morrison continued her aerial ballet overhead, using her aircraft's cannon and missiles to keep the Taliban forces suppressed and disorganized. But Vasquez could hear the sound of approaching vehicles, the distinctive rumble of diesel engines that meant the cavalry was coming. Unfortunately, it was the wrong cavalry. 2 minutes to extraction, the SEAL team leader called out. Ghost 2-1, we're going to need close air support on those approaching vehicles. Morrison's response was immediate. Copy that, Shadow 7. I've got plenty of ordnance left and these bastards just made it personal. The A-10 climbed into the lightning sky, its distinctive silhouette becoming visible against the dawn, as Morrison positioned herself for what would undoubtedly be the most critical weapons pass of her career. Below, 20 Taliban vehicles were racing through the mountain passes, their occupants undoubtedly armed with everything from small arms to heavy machine guns, to more of the shoulder-fired missiles that had nearly brought down the American aircraft minutes before. But Morrison had advantages that the Taliban couldn't match: superior training, better equipment, and the kind of cold fury that came from seeing American service members held prisoner by people who didn't understand the meaning of honor. She rolled into her attack dive, and Captain Vasquez had the surreal experience of watching close air support from the ground while being protected by it at the same time. It was a perspective she would never forget. The valley erupted in fire and thunder as Morrison's Maverick missiles found their targets among the approaching Taliban convoy. From her position 800 meters up the slope, Nakamura watched through her scope as vehicles simply vanished in balls of orange flame, their occupants never knowing what hit them. Scratch 8 vehicles, Morrison reported with professional satisfaction. Remaining elements appear to be taking evasive action, which was military speak for the fact that the surviving Taliban vehicles were scattering like startled sheep, their drivers suddenly more interested in finding cover than in reaching the firefight that was rapidly turning against their comrades. Nakamura allowed herself a moment of professional pride. Morrison was flying the kind of mission that made other pilots jealous: danger close air support in mountainous terrain, precision weapons delivery within meters of friendly forces, and threat suppression that had effectively ended an enemy counterattack before it could develop. Shadow 7, this is Dustoff 7-2, came a new voice on the radio, this one belonging to the medevac helicopter pilot who was presumably inbound to extract the rescued prisoners. I show multiple hot spots in your area. Can you give me a sitrep on LZ conditions? Lieutenant Commander Restrepo keyed his radio while continuing to scan the approaches to their position through his rifle scope. Dustoff 7-2, LZ is secure, but expect possible harassing fire from scattered enemy elements. Ghost 2-1 has been keeping them honest, but we've got wounded American personnel who need immediate extraction. Roger, Shadow 7, Dustoff 7-2 is 2 minutes out. Nakamura could hear the helicopter before she could see it, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades echoing off the mountain walls as the HH-60 Pave Hawk approached their position. The pilot was flying nap of the earth, using the terrain to mask his approach from any remaining Taliban forces that might have shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. But even the best helicopter pilot in the world was vulnerable during landing and takeoff, when the aircraft was essentially a stationary target that could be engaged with everything from small arms to rocket-propelled grenades. The next 60 seconds would determine whether this rescue mission ended in success or catastrophe. All stations, this is Ghost 2-1. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter with the authority of someone who had just spent the last 20 minutes owning the airspace above the battlefield. I'll maintain overwatch during extraction. Any son of a bitch who even thinks about taking a shot at that helicopter is going to discover what 30mm depleted uranium tastes like. The Pave Hawk flared into the landing zone with the kind of aggressive precision that spoke of a pilot who had done this before under similar circumstances. Before the wheels had fully touched down, crewmen were already jumping out to help load the rescued prisoners, their movements economical and professional, despite the fact that they were operating in what was still technically hostile territory. Captain Vasquez found herself running across broken ground toward the helicopter, supported by one of the SEALs who had cut her bonds 20 minutes earlier. Behind her, She could hear the other members of her crew making the same desperate sprint toward safety, their boots crunching on stone and their breath coming in short gasps from the combination of high altitude and adrenaline. Technical Sergeant Williams stumbled and nearly fell, but Petty Officer Park materialized beside him like magic, hauling the wounded crew chief toward the helicopter with the easy strength of someone accustomed to carrying heavy loads across difficult terrain. "Go, go, go," shouted the Pave Hawks crew chief, his hands already reaching out to pull the first of the rescued Americans into the aircraft's cabin. "We've got movement on the southern ridge." Nakamura threw herself into the helicopter and immediately looked back toward the ridgeline the crew chief had indicated. Through the aircraft's small window, she could see muzzle flashes among the rocks, the distinctive signature of small arms fire directed toward their position. But the shots were poorly aimed and too far away to be effective. The Taliban forces were firing more out of frustration than any real hope of preventing the extraction. "Dustoff 72 is lifting off with 7 American personnel," came the pilot's voice over the radio. "Thanks for the air cover, Ghost. You saved our asses today." Morrison's response carried the satisfaction of a job well done. "Roger that, Dustoff. It's been my pleasure. Ghost 2-1 is returning to base." The flight back to Bagram Air Base gave Captain Vasquez time to process what had just happened. Sitting in the Pave Hawks cabin, surrounded by the other members of her crew and the SEAL team that had risked their lives to save them, she found herself studying Lieutenant Commander Nakamura with new understanding. The woman sitting across from her wasn't just a Navy pilot who happened to be embedded with ground forces. She was someone who had voluntarily left the safety of her cockpit to experience warfare from the perspective of the people she was trained to protect. Someone who had traded the godlike power of flying an A-10 Thunderbolt for the intimate vulnerability of ground combat. "Why?" Vasquez asked finally, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's engine noise. Nakamura looked up from the medical kit she'd been using to treat Williams's head wound. "Why what? Why are you down here with them instead of up there with us?" It was a question that had been bothering Vasquez since the moment she'd learned that the woman helping to rescue her was a fellow pilot. Air Force and Navy might have their inter-service rivalries, but aviators understood each other in ways that ground pounders never quite grasped. They shared the same perspective on warfare, the same understanding of how battles looked from 30,000 feet above the chaos. Nakamura was quiet for a moment, her hands continuing their careful work on Williams's injury while she formulated her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had given the question serious thought. "Because I realized I was fighting a war I didn't really understand," she said. "I could put ordnance on target, I could provide close air support, I could even save lives from up there. But I was doing it all from a distance, making life and death decisions about people I'd never met, in situations I'd never experienced myself." She gestured toward the SEALs sitting around them, men who had just completed a mission that had required them to put their lives on the line for people they'd never met before today. These guys don't have the luxury of distance. When they pull the trigger, they can see the whites of their enemy's eyes. When they call for air support, they're betting their lives that the pilot overhead understands exactly what's happening on the ground. Vasquez nodded slowly, beginning to understand. It was one thing to provide close air support from the safety of an armored cockpit 6 miles above the battlefield. It was something entirely different to be on the ground, feeling the concussion from your own aircraft's weapons, trusting that the pilot overhead possessed the skill and judgment to put high-explosive ordnance within meters of your position without killing you in the process. "So you volunteered to find out what it was like down here." "I volunteered to learn how to be better at my job," Nakamura corrected gently. "Turns out they're the same thing." Through the helicopter's window, Vasquez could see the distinctive silhouette of Morrison's A-10 flying escort, the aircraft's weapons pylons now empty, but its presence serving as a reminder that American air power was still watching over them. In a few hours, Morrison would be back at Bagram, debriefing her mission and preparing for the next call for close air support. But the lessons learned today would stay with all of them for the rest of their careers. The helicopter began its descent toward Bagram's runway, and Vasquez could see ground crews already positioning themselves to receive both the rescued aircrew and the SEAL team that had made their rescue possible. In a few minutes, they would be safe, surrounded by friendly forces and proper medical facilities. But safety, Vasquez realized, was a relative concept in a war zone. Tomorrow, there would be other missions, other Americans in danger, other opportunities for people like Morrison and Nakamura and the SEALs to put their lives on the line for each other. It was both humbling and inspiring, this reminder that warfare wasn't just about technology and firepower and tactical superiority. At its core, it was about human beings making the decision to risk everything for each other, whether that risk came from 30,000 feet above the battlefield or 30 meters away in a rocky mountain valley. The helicopter touched down with a gentle thump, and the crew chief was already opening the cabin door before the rotors had stopped spinning. "Welcome home," he said with a grin. "Glad to have you back." 3 days later, Captain Vasquez found herself in the base intelligence office, staring at a map of Afghanistan that was covered with red pins marking Taliban strongholds and blue pins indicating friendly positions. The debrief had taken 2 days, with intelligence officers asking detailed questions about everything from the crash site location to the specific equipment the Taliban fighters had been carrying. But the question that kept bothering her wasn't on.